in ourselves to claim, for the letter kills. I have four perspectives. First, a biblical framework that underpins the thesis in the title. Then to change gears from that and move to the cultural setting, which is ours in seeking to understand the Bible. Then to change gears, and then finally to look at the whole matter in relationship to ourselves as individuals. So I'll try and make my points clear as I go along, looking first of all at it, if you like, biblically. The Oxford English Dictionary, which is the only dictionary that anyone should really pay attention to, defines inadequacy as, quotes, the condition or quality of being inadequate. If you think about that, you look up a dictionary for help, and that's as good as it can do. Perhaps I misspoke in commending the dictionary at all. But rather what it is pointing out is that inadequacy is an indication of being unequal to what a task requires. Being unequal to what a task requires. And it is that very issue that in the NIV from which I was reading, Paul addresses at the very end of verse 16, and in a simple sentence when he asks the question, what Paul is doing there is he's addressing the issue of adequacy. And his expressions of confidence, particularly in this second letter, are he is unequal to the task in himself, and he makes it perfectly clear that the secret to his usefulness in ministry cannot be traced to any natural competence. So in verse 5 again, not that we are competent or sufficient or adequate in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God. Now this is not an aberration on the part of Paul. Paul's entire understanding, not only of himself, but also of the ministry to which God has called him. And in addressing the Corinthians in his second letter, part of the challenge that he faces is found in responding to those who have opposed him and who accuse him of being cowardly and of being unworldly, of being worldly, I should say, and of being and see if what I'm telling you is true. And if you have an NIV and you're open there, who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. Classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves, when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. They're actually writing their own CVs. They're conducting their own interviews. They have decided who they are and how wonderful. About yourself that matters. What you say about yourself means nothing in God's work. What you say about yourself means nothing in God's work. And so he says if there's any boasting to be done, it mustn't be about personal achievements, but rather it must be about the Lord. And it has been underpinning Apollos watered, but actors have been boasting, among other things, about their Jewishness and about their servanthood. And are they Abraham's descendant? Or what he goes on to describe is his experience of suffering for Christ. He does not list his credentials in terms of the numbers that had emerged to hear him preach. He says, and I'm out of my mind to say this, if you want to consider my life and my ministry, then consider it distinctly in terms of inadequacy. And then he goes through his list. Been in prison more frequently, flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again, and all the way through. It's not dissimilar to what he does when he ends his letter in Galatians. He says, I don't want really to have any trouble from any of you that I've written to. And he doesn't then say, because you all know how prestigious I am, because you all know that I am the great mighty Apostle Paul. No, if you recall, what he says is, I don't really want to have any trouble from you, because I bear in my body the marks of Christ. In other words, his credential is a credential of weakness. His appeal, the appeal of a bag away in a large limousine. In a basket from a window in the wall, and I slipped through his hands. Not exactly an auspicious departure from Damascus. Could he ever have forgotten the great contrast between the way in which he had proceeded to Damascus, in all of the pride of his heart, breathing out threatenings and slaughter against those who name the name of Jesus Christ? And now he leaves, squeezed into a basket and pushed out through the wall and scarpering away to safety. Says, wait, it was there that the persecutor became the persecuted. And in that new experience now of persecution, in all of the weakness that unfolds, Paul declares the credentials of his ministry. And so in chapter 12, which of course you are greatly familiar with, he is aware of the fact that the opportunity for boasting concerning the peculiar experience of being caught up into the third heaven is a wonderful one. If ever you had an opportunity to brag, to go on the equivalent of Christian TV and let everybody know what had happened to you in those strange moments, it is there for you to do. But he says, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to use that as a basis for self-promotion. I'm not going to use that as a platform to set myself forward and make these people know, who are my detractors, just how significant I am and just what I have experienced of God and all the things that are peculiar to me. He says, I'm not going to do that. I could do that, but I choose not to do that. It's along the lines of his arrival in Corinth, isn't it? First difficulty. But because he recognized the incongruity in the proclamation of a message that was so foolish. There is a lesson in this in passing. My boss in Edinburgh all those years ago makes a wonderful comment on this. He says, of all the contexts in which boasting is inappropriate, this surely heads the list to elevate ourselves. So he says, I'm not in his life. There was given me, verse 7, a thorn in my flesh. This is his theologizing of his experience. It's not our jurisdiction here to go into this just now. But the way in which he expresses big head of a handicap to keep me in, and to keep me from becoming a fat head. I was given the gift of a handicap in his life at the deepest level of his physicality in order to ensure that he would understand that actually it was in the experience of weakness and inadequacy that his greatest usefulness was to be found. Now, let's finish this first point with just a couple of comments. It is in the confrontation with inadequacy that he discovers that God's grace is sufficient. You will notice that his weakness is not removed. He asked for this thorn in the flesh to be removed. That is not removed. But the weakness becomes the conduit of God's power. And I think verse 10 gives it to us perfectly in that sentence, doesn't it? The paradox of grace. When I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak. First point for a moment, and this is why some of us will never amount to anything for God. Principle. And I'm going to show you in a moment just why we are prone to do so. The glory does not lie in our inadequacy. This is not a plea for going around like Uriah Heep, trying to tell everybody, I'm a very humble man, Mr. Copperfield. I am your humble servant, Master Copperfield. If you know David Copperfield. The glory does not lie in our inadequacy, but lies in the adequacy of Christ, which is discovered in our weakness and in our insufficiency. So, again, Peterson's paraphrase at the end, he says, now I take limitations in my stride, and with good, and so the weaker I get, the stronger I become. Well, there we have it. That's enough on the first. Is the objective, weakness is the advantage. Secondly, let's look at it in terms of the cultural setting in which we read our Bibles and in which we respond to these truths. A culture that, to borrow a phrase from David Wells, has, in keeping with that assessment, and writing in the Wall Street Journal in July 2009, Peggy Noonan observed in one of her columns, quotes, "For 30 years, the self-esteem movement told the young they're perfect in every way. It's yielding something new in history, an entire generation with no proper sense of inadequacy. An entire generation with no a professor from Kent University in the south of England, Frank D. or Furedy, they couldn't find a single one. In 1986, they found 3 citations. By 1990, there were 103. A decade later, in 2000, there were a staggering 3,328 references. Who knows how many there are today, 11 years on. But what we do know today is that living for oneself and feeling good about oneself is increasingly the central and controlling feature of human existence. And such an orientation has no place for thoughts of inadequacy. Because to tolerate such notions works against the absolute essentiality of maintaining a favorable opinion of oneself. Whatever else happens, we must never ever, and if you care to read the book, he works it out very helpfully. Earlier this year, around the time of college and university graduation, David Brooks wrote an editorial in the New York Times entitled, "It's Not About You." He described the graduates setting off into the world with what he refers to as the baby boomer theology, so often iterated in commencement addresses ringing in their ears. And then he articulates that theology. Follow your passion. Chart your own course. Follow your dreams. Is the litany, preaches the self as the center of life. But, says Brooks in his concluding sentence, the purpose in life is not to find yourself. It is to lose yourself. Are we going to have to turn to the editorial pages of the New York Times in order to correct the warped theology of contemporary evangelicalism? And we shouldn't assume that this kind of pushback to any realistic, proper sense of inadequacy is a 21st century phenomenon, because it isn't. In 1946, John Sloan, who was then president of Dartmouth College, told the graduating class, quotes, "There is nothing wrong with the world." Jim Young Kim referenced the statement from 1946 and then told the graduating class, quotes, "You 6 staggering. What do you make of such a statement in 2010? The starting point for this mentality actually is not high school graduation. Children and fall off their bikes and fail has faded into the dim and distant past. Achievement is aspired to from the moment of birth, if not before. William Cohen in the New York Times says nowadays parents hire tutors to correct the pitching motions of little leaguers. Because the one thing that we couldn't possibly tolerate is for little Freddie to be a failure, or to find out that he has an inadequate little left arm, and he's just going to have to live with it for the rest of his life.